Millionaire CEO sees his ex-wife at a restaurant with 5-year-old twins who look just like him and decides to face his destiny. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. Alexander Morgan stepped out of his sleek black limousine and paused for a moment at the grand entrance of the hotel. Tall, opulent columns framed heavy glass doors, and the golden lights from the chandeliers inside spilled across the wide marble steps. People in elegant attire moved in and out, the gentle hum of conversation rising above the quiet city street. Normally, this was the kind of scene in which Alexander thrived. Public events, mingling with top philanthropists, forging new connections. Tonight, though, his pulse throbbed in his temples. He took a deep breath and moved forward, adjusting his cufflinks with a practiced gesture. His old friend and business partner, Robert, appeared at his side in the hotel lobby, wearing a supportive smile. Robert was the one person who could read Alexander's tension, despite the carefully composed expression he wore. Leaning in, Robert murmured, "You doing all right? I've never seen you this pale before a public event." Alexander nodded stiffly. "I'm fine. It's just, there's talk Olivia might be here." He didn't need to say more. Robert gave him a worried look, then clapped him gently on the shoulder. They both knew how unsettled Alexander was at the mere mention of his ex-wife's name. Inside the main foyer, a wide staircase led upward to the grand ballroom, where the fundraiser was already in full swing. Women in glittering gowns chatted in small groups, while men in dark suits spoke in low tones about finance and charity ambitions. Soft, live music drifted from overhead speakers. Alexander straightened his tie and stepped forward, determined to keep his composure. His company was hosting this event. Every eye in the room would be on him. Or so he thought. Glancing around, he spotted Olivia. She stood on the far side of the room near a table of silent auction items, talking to an older couple, her expression composed and polite. The sight of her hair, the way she tilted her head. Suddenly, Alexander felt a tightness in his chest. Memories came roaring back, the late-night arguments, the unspoken apologies, the day she walked out of his life. He almost turned away out of pure reflex, but something else caught his attention. 2 little girls, identical in every way, same dark hair, same bright eyes, were standing beside Olivia. They looked around the busy hall with obvious fascination, occasionally tugging on Olivia's hand to ask a question. Alexander's breath caught. His steps faltered. He was a tall man, but at that moment he felt strangely weightless, as if his mind were trying to deny what he was seeing. The little girls, he couldn't be sure, but there was something familiar about the way they moved, a certain tilt to their eyebrows, an expression of curious concentration that tugged at him. He forced himself to look away, swallowing hard as memories blurred with his present reality. Robert gently guided him forward, sensing that Alexander was on the verge of turning back. "All right," he muttered under his breath, "just focus on the event. You can't hide in your car all evening." Alexander gave a stiff nod. They moved deeper into the ballroom, greeting esteemed guests who applauded Alexander for hosting another ambitious charity initiative. He shook hands, forced a few smiles, but his eyes kept wandering to where Olivia stood. He managed to make polite conversation with donors, though every word felt forced. His mind raced with questions. Why was Olivia here tonight? Could those twins be? A flash of memory struck him. That last week before their divorce, when all communication broke down. She'd left so quietly, only sending a cryptic message saying she needed to move on with her life. Back then, he had been consumed by work, hardly noticing the subtle changes in her behavior. Now, regret pressed in on him like a heavy weight. Charles Dunham, a shrewd investor Alexander had been courting for an upcoming merger, approached with a glass of champagne in hand. He greeted Alexander with a broad, hollow smile. "Wonderful event," Charles said, his tone dripping with artificial warmth. "I hear the turnout is fantastic. So many philanthropic opportunities." His gaze flickered across the room, finally resting on the small shape of the two giggling girls weaving around Olivia. A glint of curiosity passed over Charles's features, and he lowered his voice. "It's good to see everyone enjoying themselves, even your unexpected guests." Alexander felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He gave a curt smile. "Yes, it's quite the surprise." Charles dipped his head in a mock gesture of sympathy before moving on, still smiling that smug smile. The man thrived on tension, on corporate chess moves, always seeking the next piece of leverage. Alexander suspected Charles was already piecing things together. Any scandal could be used as a bargaining chip in their negotiations. The thought left Alexander uneasy. Before Alexander could steady his nerves, an event coordinator rushed up, reminding him of his role as the evening's host. He was guided to a small stage at the front of the ballroom where he was expected to deliver a brief welcome speech. Standing under the bright lights, he cleared his throat, scanning the crowd. The usual flashes of phone cameras and the hush of attentive listeners settled into place, but he barely registered any of it. For just a moment, he locked eyes with Olivia across the room. Her expression was unreadable, but the presence of the two little girls at her side was like a physical blow to his chest. He quickly rattled off his standard remarks about philanthropy, the importance of giving back, how grateful he was to all attendees for their generosity. Applause followed, though it felt distant. As soon as he finished, he stepped down, ignoring the bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Robert, standing at the base of the stage, gave him a worried once-over. "You might want to step outside for a moment, get some air," he suggested. Alexander nodded, handing off the microphone to a staff member and making his way toward the terrace. By chance, his path took him close to Olivia and the twins. He instinctively slowed, trying to catch their conversation, but the closer he got, the more he felt his heart drumming in his ears. As if sensing his presence, one of the girls looked up at him. She had wide, curious eyes, so much like his. She tilted her head as she studied him, a small question forming on her lips. For a second, Alexander didn't know what to do. He was a well-trained CEO used to negotiating billion-dollar deals under pressure, but this child's innocent gaze left him fumbling. He finally managed a polite smile, nodding a greeting to Olivia, whose face betrayed a brief flash of surprise. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but he simply murmured, "Excuse me," and walked past, feeling like his entire identity was unraveling. He needed a moment alone. On the terrace, the crisp evening air did little to calm the whirlwind inside. He leaned on the stone balustrade, gazing over the city lights. The echoes of music from inside were distant and muted. All he could think about was the possibility that Olivia had two little girls who looked just like him. 1,000 questions raced through his mind. When were they born? Why hadn't she told him? Were they truly his? Or was he just seeing resemblances born of his own guilt? The terrace doors swung open with a crash, and Robert burst out, a frantic look on his face. "There's trouble," he said quickly. Alexander turned sharply, feeling a jolt of adrenaline. "Some paparazzi managed to slip inside. I heard them bragging about snapping some pictures of you with—" He didn't finish. They both understood. Pictures of Alexander with Olivia and two girls who could be mistaken for his daughters would ignite the gossip pages, jeopardizing everything he'd worked so hard to maintain. Without pausing to think, Alexander hurried back inside. Sure enough, near the entrance, a man with a camera was rushing through the crowd, ignoring startled guests who tried to block his way. The camera's lens swung wildly, and from across the room, Alexander could see images flickering on the digital screen, images of himself, of Olivia, of the twins. Something inside him ignited. He strode forward, intercepting the paparazzo, who stumbled at the last second and slammed into a tall display table. A waiter yelped as champagne glasses shattered around them, drawing gasps and hushed exclamations from the other guests. Security converged in a flurry of black suits. The photographer sputtered in indignation as they seized him, demanding his camera. Olivia hurried toward the frightened twins, cradling them protectively. Alexander felt the room's eyes boring into him, but he forced his gaze to remain steady. He calmly insisted that the paparazzo hand over his memory card. Eventually, Robert stepped in, and the club's security escorted the man out, seizing the illegal photos in the process. When the dust settled, people returned to their conversations, though the atmosphere was charged with speculation. A few onlookers whispered excitedly, likely recognizing the tension between Alexander and Olivia. He helped one of the staff pick up a spilled tray, all the while feeling Olivia's presence just a few feet away. He turned to meet her gaze. This time she didn't look away. There was no hostility in her eyes, only a guarded kind of recognition. Emma and Sophia peeked around her legs, their expressions uncertain. He wanted to speak, to say something normal, but his mind was spinning. He settled for a simple, "I'm sorry about all of this." Olivia nodded, pressing her lips together. Alexander glanced at the two little girls, noticing again their resemblance to him. They seemed so curious, yet shielded by their mother's arm. Charles loitered at the edge of the crowd, watching with a predatory gleam. Then he slinked away, clearly satisfied with the disruption. Alexander felt a rush of protectiveness toward Olivia and the children. In that moment, the bigger problem, the entire reason he was rattled, struck him full force. Were those twins really his? And if so, how had he gone so long without knowing? He turned back to Olivia, searching for answers in her face. She offered none, only a quiet, composed stare. Slowly, Emma and Sophia peeked from behind her. For the briefest instant, one of them broke into a shy smile. Alexander's chest constricted. He was certain he had just glimpsed his own smile mirrored there. He gave a small nod, letting them be. The chaos had settled, and for the moment, the threat was handled. But his heart pounded with the realization that the worst storm was still to come. The event continued around them, but Alexander could hardly hear the music or the clatter of silverware and wine glasses. Everything zeroed in on the two little girls. As he backed away toward a quieter corner, the truth seized him. Maybe all his suspicions were correct. Maybe those twins were his daughters. He pressed a hand to his chest, as though checking if his heart was still beating. The possibility filled him with awe, fear, and an odd, fragile hope. He ventured one final glance across the room. The twins were giggling together about something, oblivious to the swirl of adult tension. The sight caused Alexander's stomach to flip. If they were truly his, how could he make up for lost time? How could he ever rebuild what he and Olivia had once destroyed? Feeling the weight of that question, he steadied himself against a column near the exit. His mind whirled, but his thoughts returned to those two smiling faces and the undeniable pang of recognition. There was no more dancing around it. In that instant, he realized his life might never be the same. Alexander, shaken to his core, stares at the twins. His heart races as he whispers to himself, "They're mine. They have to be." The echoes of the fundraiser still pulsed through the grand ballroom as Alexander lingered by a tall marble pillar, trying to steady himself. His own voice replayed over and over in his mind, "They're mine. They have to be." He had muttered those words under his breath in a moment of raw disbelief, and now he couldn't shake the tightness in his chest. The elegance of the evening, the polished smiles, the jazz music drifting from the stage, it all felt out of place with the storm raging inside him. He watched Olivia quietly from a distance. She was talking to a couple in formal attire, and on each side of her leg clung a little girl, identical dark hair framing two curious faces. With their matching dresses and wide eyes scanning the crowd, they seemed oblivious to the swarm of questions tearing through Alexander's mind. Every step he took in their direction felt heavier than the last, until a sense of duty tugged him back. A small group of corporate sponsors waved him over, looking eager to discuss some matter related to the charity. Reluctantly, he forced himself to join them. The conversation was a blur of polite phrases and handshakes. Alexander nodded and thanked them for their contributions, but his focus kept drifting away. His assistant tapped him on the shoulder, prompting him to sign a quick form for the fundraiser's financial records. He managed a forced smile. In the back of his mind, the unsettling question twisted like a knife. Were those girls truly his children? He excused himself as soon as he could, scanning the crowd again for Olivia. She was nowhere in sight. His chest tightened in panic, worried she might have slipped away with the girls. Then he noticed movement near the rear hallway, where the lights were dimmer. With deliberate steps, he moved past an arrangement of tall, potted palms until he caught a glimpse of familiar silhouettes. Olivia's voice drifted toward him, quiet but tense. She was speaking with someone he didn't recognize, a slim man in dark clothes. Alexander strained to catch fragments of their conversation. The man seemed to be asking about the girls, his voice prying and intrusive. Immediately, Alexander's guard went up, suspecting a reporter or paparazzo. Sure enough, a camera strap dangled from the man's shoulder. His stance was aggressive, leaning far too close to Olivia. The twins stood behind their mother, clutching her skirt. Alexander clenched his jaw and picked up his pace, determined to stop this intrusion. The moment the man spotted him, he stepped back, plastering on a smug grin. "Hey, I'm just trying to get a quick statement." "No," Alexander cut him off. He positioned himself between Olivia and the man. "Not tonight. If you want interviews, go through our PR team." Olivia's eyes flickered with gratitude, though her face remained set in calm neutrality. She gestured to the girls to stay behind her. The stranger tried to argue, but before he could press further, Robert appeared with a pair of security guards, ushering the paparazzo away. The man shouted something about a hidden family and juicy headlines, but his protests were lost in the commotion as he was escorted out of the hallway. The girls peered up at Alexander, startled. One of them, the braver of the two, took a hesitant step forward. "Mommy, is he your friend?" she asked in a small voice that sent a tremor through Alexander's heart. He wanted to say something, anything, to put her at ease, but his mind tumbled over every possibility. Friend wasn't the right word. He didn't know what he was to them, not yet. Olivia knelt next to the girl, smoothing a hand over her hair. Her calm, reassuring tone belied the turmoil Alexander could sense beneath it. "He's someone who was looking out for us," she said. Then she glanced up at Alexander as if silently acknowledging the truth, that his intervention was both a relief and a complication. "Thank you," she added quietly. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "The last thing I want is for anyone to harass you." His gaze lingered on the twins. They stared back, curious but shy, clearly picking up on the tension. Emma and Sophia, he thought. He didn't know which was which, but he had caught a whisper of their names earlier. A sudden wave of guilt crashed over him. Did he even deserve to know which child was Emma and which was Sophia? Hadn't he been absent all these years? Before he could dwell on it, a commotion arose at the entrance to the hallway. Another paparazzo had slipped inside the venue. Cameras flashed as the man snapped rapid-fire photos. At the same time, Charles Dunham appeared as if on cue, surveying the scene with a thin smile. It was impossible to miss the glint of satisfaction in Charles's eyes as he watched the chaos. Alexander sprang into action, pushing through the startled guests to catch up with the photographer. This time, the paparazzo was making a beeline toward the ballroom, presumably to corner the three of them or stir up drama. Alexander lunged forward, grabbing the man by the shoulder. The photographer spun around, nearly dropping his camera in surprise. "Let go of me!" the man hissed, but Alexander refused to budge. He gestured for security again, who came hurrying over. In the process, a brief struggle ensued. Nothing too violent, but enough to send a glass clattering off a tray and a handful of guests jumping back in alarm. Olivia rushed forward, shielding the twins from the scene. Their frightened eyes darted between Alexander and the scuffle. Charles stood at a distance, observing with a practiced calm, as if delighted by the spectacle. At last, the security team intervened, relieving the photographer of his equipment. Robert reappeared, looking out of breath but focused. "It's under control," Robert said firmly to Alexander. "I'll handle the rest. Go take care of them." His gaze flicked toward Olivia and the girls. Stepping away from the whirlwind, Alexander approached the small family huddled in the corner. The twins clung to their mother, their wide eyes shimmering with tears. Olivia looked worn out, her usual poise cracked by worry. Guilt twisted in Alexander's stomach. It felt as though his presence had done nothing but bring them distress. If he had known about them earlier, could he have prevented all of this? He took a careful step closer, trying not to alarm the children. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said softly. The twins stared at him in silence. He searched their faces for any sign of acceptance, but saw only confusion. Olivia gave him a tight nod of acknowledgement, then turned to the girls. "Let's find a quieter spot." They moved down a hallway lined with gilded mirrors and discreet artwork. The cacophony of the ballroom faded behind them, replaced by the softer hum of hotel staff bustling in the distance. Eventually, they reached a small alcove near the restrooms, decorated with plush chairs and a velvet bench. It was hardly private, but at least it was calmer than the main floor. The girls settled on the bench. Olivia stood in front of them, arms folded protectively. Alexander lingered, not sure whether he should join them or keep a respectful distance. His heart pounded in his chest, every nerve alive with uncertainty. He gathered his courage and approached. "May I sit for a moment?" he asked gently. Olivia hesitated, then gave a small nod. He lowered himself onto the far end of the bench, careful not to crowd the girls. For a long beat, no one spoke. Emma and Sophia, a guess, but he was certain these were their names, watched him with a blend of wariness and fascination. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. Her voice was calm, measured. "I didn't want any of this trouble. The rumors, the cameras, the stares. That's not why I came tonight." Her gaze flicked to the girls, who were swinging their legs in anxious restlessness. "I brought them along because I thought it was just a quiet charity event. I never expected the media would be sniffing around so soon." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. I'd do anything to protect you, to protect them." A moment passed. Emma looked up at Olivia, then at Alexander, fiddling with the hem of her tiny dress. They took pictures of us," she mumbled, sounding hurt and confused. Alexander's chest constricted. "They did, but we made sure they can't use them," he said gently, hoping his voice sounded reassuring. "I promise that's the last time it'll happen if I can help it." Olivia clasped her hands together, her knuckles turning white. "Look, this life you lead, it comes with a lot of exposure, a lot of eyes on every move you make. That's exactly what I tried to avoid when I—" Her words trailed off, and Alexander saw the pain flicker across her face. In the quiet, the twins glanced at their mother, sensing there was a deeper story lurking beneath. Robert appeared briefly down the corridor, noticed the tense conversation, and quietly slipped away, leaving them to sort things out. Emma leaned against her sister, while Sophia studied Alexander with those familiar dark eyes. Without warning, Sophia's small voice piped up, "Are you famous or something?" Olivia looked mortified at the blunt question, but Alexander offered a soft smile. "Some people might say that, but I'm just a businessman. I handle a big company, and sometimes that means people pay attention to things that should be private." Sophia nodded seriously, as though she were an adult absorbing complicated truths. The entire time, Alexander's pulse thudded with the unsaid reality that these bright, curious children might be his. After another pause, Olivia drew in a shaky breath. She turned away from the twins, lowering her voice so only Alexander could hear. "I never told you about them because I wasn't sure what you'd do. I was afraid of how the press, your board, your competitors, might use them." She swallowed hard, glancing at the little girls. I had my reasons for keeping them out of that world." Alexander's eyes burned with emotion. He wanted to argue, to beg her to believe he'd never let harm come to them, but part of him knew that the relentless pursuit of power and success had once made him blind to everything else. He had to earn her trust again, maybe from the very bottom. A distant noise from the ballroom reminded them they weren't completely isolated. Olivia gathered the girls, telling them they'd be heading home soon. She guided them gently toward the exit, but Alexander couldn't let them leave without at least some sort of understanding. He stepped closer, his voice trembling with sincerity. "Please," he said, "I'm asking you to let me be part of their lives. I want to know them. Even if it's difficult, even if my world is complicated. I swear I'll protect them." Olivia's stare was guarded yet touched by the edges of sympathy. She searched his face as if weighing whether his words carried enough truth. Then she exhaled, a decision forming in her eyes. "We can talk more, but not here. Not tonight." She glanced down at the two little heads and her voice softened. "For now, just accept it. They're yours." Alexander stood frozen in the hallway, her words echoing. "They're yours." The weight of fatherhood sinks in, and he realizes everything is about to change. Alexander left the hotel that night with Olivia's words ringing in his ears. "They're yours." Simple, undeniable, and destined to upend everything he'd ever thought about himself. Even the city lights outside seemed harsher than usual, glaring reminders that he couldn't sweep reality under the rug anymore. He collapsed into the back seat of his car and stared through the tinted window, the night's chaos unfolding behind him as the limo pulled away. His phone buzzed constantly, text messages from colleagues, missed calls from board members, urgent updates about the upcoming merger, but all of it blurred against the sudden thunder in his chest. Emma and Sophia weren't just two children he'd glimpsed at a charity event. They were his daughters. The next morning, Alexander sat behind the long glass desk in his opulent high-rise office, the sunlight reflecting off the skyline and onto polished floors. He stared at spreadsheets and contract drafts, but found himself unable to concentrate. Usually this was his domain, a place of order and efficiency, where he reviewed financial reports and made calculated decisions worth millions. But now, the echo of Emma's shy voice and Sophia's big questioning eyes intruded on his every thought. He tapped his pen against a page and realized he hadn't read a single line. Robert stepped in, dressed immaculately as ever, and immediately sensed Alexander's distraction. Without saying a word, he closed the office door behind him. "So," he began in a low voice, "I'm guessing you didn't sleep much." Alexander let out a heavy breath, leaning back in his leather chair. "You could say that." He ran a hand over his face, remembering the swirl of confusion that kept him awake half the night. "Everything I used to think was so important just feels small compared to this. I don't know how to handle it." Robert nodded. "Look, maybe start with the basics. Confirm paternity if you need to, though from the way you looked at them, I'm guessing you don't need much proof. Then figure out how to keep them safe. You know Charles and the rest of the board won't hesitate to use this if it risks the merger." The mention of Charles hit like a cold slap. Alexander's gaze hardened. "He's already sniffing around. Last night he was practically gleeful about my unexpected guests. He'll stir up trouble, I'm sure." Just as he finished speaking, the phone on his desk lit up with Charles's name. Robert arched a brow. "You want me to take that?" But Alexander shook his head, swallowing down the knot in his throat. He pressed the speaker button, and Charles's smooth voice filled the room. "Alexander, good morning. Heard there was a bit of excitement at the event last night. I do hope it won't affect your focus on our merger." His tone was polite on the surface, but Alexander detected the mock concern lying underneath. "I'm not distracted," Alexander responded, though he wondered if Charles could hear the tension in his voice. "Everything is under control." "Glad to hear it." There was a brief pause, then a carefully measured hint of sympathy. I would hate for personal matters to overshadow the final negotiations. You know our investors are very particular about the CEO's public image." Alexander clenched his jaw. He forced his tone to remain calm, even though irritation prickled at the base of his neck. "I'm aware of my responsibilities." "Excellent. Then I'll see you at the board meeting this afternoon." The call ended before Alexander could reply. He exhaled and glanced at Robert, who shrugged. "He's a snake," Robert said bluntly. "We'll handle him. You just focus on handling everything else." Alexander tried to return to his spreadsheets, but the lines of data swam before his eyes. After half an hour of forcing himself to read, he gave up. With a determined sigh, he rose from his chair. "I'm going to see Olivia," he said. "I need answers. I need to talk to them." Robert's features softened. "Good. Let me know if you need help. And be careful. Don't lose sight of that board meeting, or Charles will slip something under your nose." Leaving the office behind, Alexander took the elevator down, mind racing with all the thoughts he'd kept bottled inside. Why hadn't Olivia told him sooner? Had she truly believed his world was too dangerous for their daughters? Was that the entire reason for their divorce? Or just part of it? A short drive later, he found himself outside a quiet condo building in a neighborhood far from the sleek towers he frequented. The building wasn't fancy, but it had a cozy, well-kept charm. He buzzed Olivia's unit, and for a long moment there was no response. He was about to turn away when the intercom crackled. "Yes?" "It's Alexander," he said, trying not to sound too tense. A brief silence followed. Then the door's lock clicked, allowing him in. Inside, the walls were painted in soft colors, lined with framed family photos and children's drawings. It felt warm and domestic in a way Alexander's own immaculate penthouse never had. Olivia stood in the open doorway of her unit, arms folded defensively. He could see the curiosity in her eyes, mixed with caution. "Come in," she said quietly. Her tone was reserved but not hostile. He followed her into a modest living room where a couple of small toys lay scattered near the couch. The television was turned off, and the blinds allowed in a gentle wash of daylight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She motioned for him to sit, and he lowered himself onto the couch, glancing around. A child's sweater was draped over the armrest, and a pair of tiny shoes peeked out from under the coffee table. They felt like silent witnesses to the life he'd missed. Alexander began, but before he could say more, two little heads popped out from a corner of the hallway. Emma and Sophia, each clutching a plush toy. Their bright eyes landed on him. Instantly, Emma let out a shy giggle, and Sophia tried to hide behind her sister. The sight caused his heart to clench. Olivia cast them a pointed look. "I told you girls to stay in your room for a bit," she said, not unkindly. Emma fidgeted, then whispered something into Sophia's ear. The girls retreated for a moment before reappearing, as if they couldn't resist the visitor in their living room. Alexander cleared his throat, his voice awkward. "Hi, We know who you are," Emma said, stepping forward. Her brown eyes sparkled with curiosity. "You're the man from the party." Sophia peeked around Emma and nodded. "And from Mommy's pictures," she added. "We saw them in her closet." Olivia closed her eyes momentarily, letting out a small sigh. "Girls, give us a moment to talk, please." They hesitated, then scurried back toward the hallway. Alexander felt a rush of regret. That was all the introduction he'd managed? He'd never imagined meeting his own children would feel so surreal and painful. "I need to know everything," he said in a low tone, focusing on Olivia. "I know I've asked this before, but why didn't you tell me?" She took a seat on the chair across from him, posture rigid. "It was complicated. When I found out I was pregnant, you were in the middle of that takeover deal, the one everyone said was going to define your entire legacy. Every time I tried to talk to you, you were either on a plane or in a boardroom." Her words came out more matter-of-fact than bitter, but there was sadness beneath them. I sensed that if I told you, you'd insist on doing the right thing, but we'd only wind up in a vicious circle of press coverage, corporate sabotage, and fighting. I needed peace, and I needed to protect them." Alexander opened his mouth to protest, but then he remembered the nights he worked until dawn, ignoring her calls because he was too busy. A swirl of guilt rose in his chest. "I should have known you were in trouble," he said softly. "I should have paid more attention." "Well, you didn't," Olivia replied, a trace of old hurt slipping into her tone. "So I made my choice. I left." He nodded, swallowing hard. "And now? What happens now that I know?" Olivia's gaze flicked to the hallway where the girls had vanished. "That's up to you, but I'm warning you, Alexander. My priority is them. I won't let anything jeopardize their happiness." Before he could respond, Sophia tiptoed back into the room, holding a piece of paper. She offered it to Alexander with trembling hands. "It's a picture I drew. It's me, Emma, Mommy, and you can add yourself if you want," she said timidly. He took the paper. A swirl of crayons in bright colors formed the outlines of 3 figures. Off to one side there was a space blank, as though waiting for a 4th figure. Alexander blinked, overcome by a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. He looked up at Sophia, managing a faint, grateful smile. "I'd like that," he whispered. Emma joined them, curiosity shining in her eyes. "How come you never came to see us?" she asked softly, and the question struck him harder than he could have imagined. Olivia started to scold her, but Alexander gently shook his head, wanting to answer for himself. He rose from the couch and knelt so he was at eye level with his daughters, feeling the edge of the coffee table dig into his knee. He met Emma's gaze steadily. "Because I didn't know you existed," he said, voice quiet and laced with sincerity. "It wasn't that I didn't want to, but now that I do, I'm going to do everything I can to make it right." Emma blinked, considering his words. Sophia pressed closer to her sister, as if sensing this was a moment too big for them to fully grasp. With effort, Alexander shifted his gaze to Olivia. "I'm aware that I've been neglectful in the past, and I don't blame you for hiding them from my world. It can be ruthless and—" "It is ruthless," Olivia interjected, a protective edge returning to her voice. "I saw how your rivals circled whenever they sensed weakness. I saw how certain board members would do anything to push you out if it meant profit. I didn't want the twins anywhere near that." Alexander bowed his head. "I promise I'll keep them safe this time. I won't let the corporate drama touch them. I'll figure out how to be a father no matter what it costs me." He let out a shaky breath, turning back to the girls. "I want to get to know you both if you'll let me." Sophia and Emma exchanged a quick glance, and then Emma gave a tiny shrug. "I guess that would be okay," she said, a cautious smile forming on her face. Sophia grinned shyly, nodding. Olivia stood, her posture still stiff. "We'll take it slowly. They deserve that, but don't barge into their lives and then vanish the second your business calls." Alexander rose to his full height, bracing himself for the promise he was about to make. "I won't vanish. No matter how complicated this gets, I'm staying." Olivia studied his expression for a long moment, as though searching for any hint of doubt. Finally, she walked him to the door. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at the girls, who waved from behind their mother. Every fiber of his being felt charged with a new sense of responsibility and fear, because living up to this promise might be the hardest thing he'd ever done. As he stepped into the hallway, Olivia's voice followed him. It trembled with both hope and fear. "Don't make promises you can't keep." Alexander lingered in the hallway outside Olivia's condo, the echo of her words trailing behind him. "Don't make promises you can't keep." Her voice hung in the still air, tapping into every insecurity he had. He descended the stairs slowly, turning the phrase over in his mind. That single admonition might have been a simple warning, but it felt more like a plea, an urging to stand by what he'd told her and, most importantly, the 2 girls who were his daughters. By the time he reached his car, he'd made a decision. He wasn't going to let fear derail him again. He tapped at his phone screen until Olivia's number lit up, then sent a short text. "I'd like to take the twins out somewhere fun. Let me prove I'm serious about this. Just a few hours whenever you think it's best. Thank you." He hit send, heart pounding. Taking Emma and Sophia into his life meant facing new, uncharted territory. He thought about his usual days, conference calls, strategy sessions, endless emails, and realized he hardly knew how to interact with 5-year-old children. Still, nothing about fatherhood would be easy if he stayed paralyzed with self-doubt. Early the next morning, after a sleepless night, he stared at his phone again. There was no reply. He prepared to head to the office, summoning as much focus as he could muster. In his penthouse, every piece of furniture looked too pristine, every surface polished to a fault. He'd built this place around the image of a busy executive with no time for family distractions. Now it felt hollow. Just as he reached for the door, his phone buzzed. Olivia's name appeared on the screen with a short message. "Let's try tomorrow. Late morning. A child-friendly cafe downtown. Keep it low-key." Alexander let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It was more than a small step. It was permission. The next day, he arrived at the cafe before the agreed-upon time, anxious not to be late. Tucked on a quiet street corner, the spot boasted bright murals on the walls and whimsical decorations shaped like animals. Rows of tables sat near a small play area, perfect for children. He glanced around, double-checking the chairs and ensuring the place was calm enough for them to relax without drawing attention. A few minutes later, Olivia walked in, each hand holding onto a twin. Emma wore pink sneakers and a determined look, while Sophia had green barrettes in her dark hair, glancing shyly around the space. They spotted Alexander immediately. He stood up, offering a careful smile. For a brief moment, a rush of warmth spread through him. He liked seeing them out in the open, like a normal family going about a normal day. "Hi," he greeted softly, pulling a chair out for Olivia. The girls eyed him curiously, still trying to figure him out. "Thanks for coming." "It's a good start," Olivia replied, her tone reserved yet not unfriendly. She settled Emma and Sophia into chairs, watching how they reacted to Alexander. "I'm trusting you," she added in a lower voice. He nodded, swallowing a hint of nervousness. "I appreciate that." He turned to the girls. "Have you two been here before?" Sophia shook her head. "No, it's pretty," she said, looking around at the colorful decor. Emma tapped her foot against the chair leg, half smiling at her sister. Alexander caught the flicker of excitement in their eyes and felt a surge of relief. Maybe this outing could actually go well. Once the waitress arrived, they ordered small pastries and brightly colored juices for the kids, while Alexander and Olivia each got coffee. He made an effort to involve Emma and Sophia in the conversation, asking which flavors they preferred, whether they liked drawing or playing with building blocks, or what cartoons they watched. They were cautious at first, answering in single words, but gradually their curiosity surfaced, and their little voices became clearer. When the pastries arrived, Emma took one bite and wrinkled her nose, murmuring that it tasted strange. Without hesitation, Alexander gently offered her a different pastry from the plate, smiling when she took it. "Thanks," she said, a small sign that she was warming up. Sophia nodded as she watched him, trying to hide her grin behind her cup. Seeing the girls respond to him, Olivia relaxed ever so slightly. She leaned back in her chair, sipping coffee, letting them all get a feel for the moment. Alexander was just about to ask Emma and Sophia about their favorite animals when his phone lit up, Robert's name flashing across the screen. He'd been waiting for an update on the impending business deal, but he quickly pressed it to silent mode. "Work?" Olivia asked, noticing. Alexander offered an apologetic look. "I'll handle it later. Right now, I'd rather talk about anything but the office." Emma giggled. "Mommy says you work a lot," she said, swinging her legs under the table. "Do you like working?" Alexander took a second to consider his answer. I do. It's challenging, he said carefully, not wanting to bore them. But I think there are more important things too. Like us? Sophia piped up, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. He smiled, feeling his chest tighten in a tender ache. Yes, exactly like you. He caught Olivia's expression, both cautious and touched. They finished their treats, then decided to walk a few blocks to a small indoor play area that boasted soft slides, climbing obstacles, and a ball pit. Alexander paid their cafe bill quickly, determined to keep the momentum of the day positive. Emma and Sophia squealed in delight when they spotted the bright foam mats and large tunnels upon entering. They clambered excitedly through the structures, chasing each other with giggles that bounced off the walls. Alexander hung back at first, uncertain if he should join in or watch. He never imagined being in a play area with toddlers would intimidate him more than a high-stakes board meeting. But then Emma slipped coming down the slide, scraping her knee on the mat. She let out a little cry, more startled than hurt. Olivia moved swiftly, but Alexander was already there, gently lifting Emma into his arms. He checked her knee, heart pounding with concern. "It's just a scrape, I promise," he said softly, pressing a clean tissue to it. He felt a jolt of relief when he saw no serious injury. "Does it hurt too much?" Emma blinked away the tears. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice trembling. Alexander held her for a moment longer, cradling her as if she were something fragile. He glanced at Olivia, who gave him a measured nod of thanks. For the first time since he discovered the truth about the twins, he felt like he might be doing something right. When Emma calmed down, she hopped back to her feet, refusing to let a small scrape ruin her fun. Sophia took her sister's hand, and soon they were giggling again, racing across the play area. Olivia stood beside Alexander, crossing her arms in relief. "You did well," she said, her tone thoughtful. "I never knew you could be so gentle." He smiled, feeling the faintest wave of pride. "I'm learning. I know I've missed a lot." A ripple of tension returned as they watched the twins, who were shrieking happily in a ball pit. Alexander's phone vibrated again. He resisted the urge to look until Olivia whispered, "It could be important." With a resigned sigh, he glanced at the message. It was from Robert, warning that Charles was causing headaches at the office. Alexander typed back a quick reply, telling Robert he'd deal with it later. He slipped the device into his jacket pocket, determined to focus on Emma and Sophia. This moment with them felt too precious to sacrifice to corporate drama. After nearly an hour, the twins seemed to tire. Olivia gathered them near the exit, and Alexander offered a suggestion. "How about we grab something quick to eat?" Olivia hesitated. "The girls are probably tired from all this excitement, but maybe a quick bite at a quiet place," she relented. They found a nearby sandwich shop with bright windows and cheerful staff, grabbing a table by the window. Emma and Sophia took turns describing their adventures on the slides, their imaginations running wild with the day's fun. Alexander listened, enthralled by every detail, wishing he could freeze this moment and live inside it a little longer. While they ate, Olivia's phone chimed. She glanced at the screen, her expression clouding with worry. "Is something wrong?" Alexander asked softly, concerned by the sudden shift in her demeanor. "There are more rumors about you," she said in a low voice, checking a news site. "Some headlines about secret children, though no official statement. We got lucky no one recognized the girls so far." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Charles," he muttered. "He's determined to exploit any angle he can to destabilize me before the merger's finalization." He stole a glance at Emma and Sophia, who were absorbed in their own conversation about cartoons. Knowing the storm of media gossip swirling around them made him more certain than ever that he had to protect them, no matter the cost. "I won't let those rumors spread," he promised quietly. "I'll handle Charles, the press, everything." Olivia nodded, though her eyes carried a trace of fear. "I believe you want to." but be ready. This world of yours can get ugly." Soon after, they finished their sandwiches, and Emma let out a big yawn. It was clear the twins were winding down. Alexander walked them back to his parked car, ensuring they were warm in the cool afternoon breeze. Standing on the sidewalk, he felt a surge of longing as he realized this short outing was ending. He knelt to give each girl a tentative hug. Emma leaned in shyly, and Sophia followed suit with a giggle. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice catching. "I had a really good time with you today." He rose to meet Olivia's guarded gaze. There was a softness there, mixed with continued caution. "We'll see," she said simply. "I appreciate that you're trying." They exchanged a hesitant smile. Then Olivia guided the girls down the block toward a waiting car, leaving Alexander with the bittersweet realization that while the day had gone better than expected, there were no guarantees. But it was a start, something to build on, if he could keep his promise. As he slid into his own car, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen, seeing Robert's name pop up with another alert. After tapping it open, he stiffened. Whatever was happening, it sounded urgent, a new urgency in Robert's words. As Alexander packs up to leave, his phone buzzes again. An urgent message from Robert indicates something big is about to break in the media, threatening to expose more secrets. Alexander was still in his car when the first of the headlines flashed across his phone screen. "CEO's hidden family? Merger in peril?" The words glared up at him in bold, almost taunting. His pulse jumped. This was the story Robert had warned him about moments earlier. He opened the article with a sinking feeling in his gut. Paragraphs of speculation and half-truths followed. Unnamed sources claiming he had 2 secret daughters, rumors of a scandal brewing within the board, and dire predictions that the entire merger deal might collapse under the weight of negative press. He clenched his jaw. The day he'd spent bonding with Emma and Sophia had been the most meaningful of his life so far, yet now it seemed overshadowed by corporate sabotage. He fired off a rapid text to Robert. "Meet me at the office. We need to handle this immediately." Then he pulled the car away from the curb, his mind racing with furious questions about who would leak such a sensitive rumor in the first place. By the time Alexander reached his downtown headquarters, the paparazzi had gathered outside the sleek glass lobby. Flashes sparked as he stepped out, and voices shouted over one another, demanding comments. Security guards hurried him through the front doors, shielding him from intrusive lenses. A swirl of anxiety squeezed his chest, but he held his head high. He had no time for distractions. He needed answers. He found Robert waiting in his top-floor office, pacing anxiously by the vast window that overlooked the city. The moment Alexander stepped in, Robert pointed to a stack of printed articles and digital screenshots. "It's spreading fast," he said. "Dozens of outlets are running variations of the story. Most are just rumors, but they're insistent you have children you've kept secret." Alexander set his jaw and stood behind his desk, skimming the first few lines. So they know about Emma and Sophia, but how much do they really know? Robert shrugged helplessly. "Enough to speculate that you've been hiding them, and some articles mention your ex-wife by name. Nothing about the girls' faces or identities yet, but it's only a matter of time." Anger flared in Alexander's eyes. "Charles is behind this. He must have fed the press these details. The man's been itching to destabilize my position at the head of this company to gain leverage over the merger." Robert nodded, face grim. "I'm trying to trace the leaks, but it's complicated. He might be using a third party, some ally on the board." Alexander's chest tightened. The board, of course. One of them might be helping him from the inside. He pictured the faces around that long conference table, half of them perched on the fence about whether to trust him or Charles's slick promises. If someone there was funneling information to the media, they could do untold damage. Just then, Alexander's phone buzzed. Olivia's name flashed across the screen. He answered immediately, voice taut. "Yes?" She sounded on edge. "The press is at my door, Alexander. They're buzzing the intercom, trying to get me to talk to confirm details. One of them cornered me when I went to pick up the twins from school. Alexander pressed a hand over his eyes, dread coursing through him. I'm so sorry. I didn't think they'd track you down this fast. Her voice grew quieter, trembling with fear. They're scaring the girls. People keep asking if you're abandoning them or if this is all for some twisted publicity. I can't live like this. He drew a slow breath, trying to steady his thoughts. I'll fix it, I promise. I'm going to find out who's behind the leak, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and the twins. A worried laugh slipped through. Just be careful. You know how ruthless your world is. That's the reason I left in the first place. When the call ended, he stood there a moment, letting her final words settle like a lead weight on his conscience. Indeed, the corporate realm he'd thrived in was full of sharks. It was the same environment that had once driven Olivia away. Determined, he turned to Robert. Any idea which board member might be in Charles's pocket? I'm piecing it together. I've noticed suspicious transactions. Small ones, but from accounts that link back to 2 or 3 board members who usually vote with you. Except, recently, they've been changing their tone. It's subtle, but something doesn't add up. Alexander's fists clenched. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. Let's see who cracks under pressure. That afternoon, as the board members filed into the conference room, an uneasy tension blanketed the air. The polished mahogany table glistened under overhead lights, and the thick glass windows showcased a skyline that felt oddly claustrophobic with anticipation. Men and women in sharp suits exchanged whispers, casting sidelong glances in Alexander's direction. Word of the scandal had clearly spread among them. He sat at the head of the table, imposing and silent, waiting for the murmurs to die down. Charles slipped in last, wearing an expression of well-crafted concern. Once everyone settled, Alexander wasted no time. I'm sure you've all seen the headlines. Let's address this directly. Rumors of a so-called hidden family are swirling, and it's affecting investor confidence in our pending merger. His eyes scanned the room. I need to know if anyone here has contributed to these leaks. A round of uncomfortable shifting followed. 1 or 2 members half raised their hands, wanting to speak but unsure how. Then Charles cleared his throat, flashing a polite smile. Alexander, we're all deeply sorry this is happening to you. I can only imagine how difficult it must be to juggle personal matters and the welfare of our company. Alexander eyed him coolly. Yes, it is difficult. But the bigger concern here is that someone violated confidentiality by feeding the press private information. If it's coming from within this board, I will find out. Charles spread his hands in a show of sympathy. Of course, we all want to see this resolved, but it does raise the question, can you still commit to finalizing the merger if you're occupied with a personal crisis? Investors might be worried. An anxious flicker rippled across a few board members' faces. Some nodded slightly, others stared at their notes. Alexander felt his spine stiffen. The personal jabs only confirmed his suspicion that Charles was delighting in the chaos. He gripped the edge of the table, forcing composure. My personal life won't jeopardize this merger. I'm fully prepared to see it through. One of the older members cleared his throat awkwardly. We support you, Alexander, but the market reaction is unfavorable. The media is suggesting you've hidden major information about your personal situation, and if that's true, it might cause shareholders to question your transparency. Alexander leaned forward. I never hid anything with malicious intent. I only just discovered the truth myself. Regardless, the merger stands. I ask that each of you remain cautious with any personal details you might come across. Our corporate integrity is on the line. Silence settled again. Charles fixed Alexander with a pensive look. Then he spoke, his voice carrying a faint hint of condescension. We're behind you, Alexander. I know how these rumors can spiral. Let me know if I can help manage the media. It sounded like a benevolent offer, but Alexander recognized it as a calculated move to appear supportive. He ended the meeting soon after, with little resolved except a reminder to the board that confidentiality was paramount. As the members filed out, Charles lingered, taking a slow sip from a water glass. "Quite a predicament," he remarked softly, stepping closer to Alexander. "If the scandal continues, it might threaten our big deal." Alexander exhaled a cold breath, meeting his gaze head-on. "It's interesting how you always turn up wherever trouble starts. You wouldn't happen to know anything about those articles, would you?" Charles smirked. "I'm as blindsided as you are, but you can't deny the board is losing faith in your ability to handle distractions." For a heartbeat, Alexander considered confronting him with accusations of sabotage, but he had no solid proof yet, and Charles would deny everything. Instead, Alexander lowered his voice. "I'm done playing games. Leave my family out of this." Charles's eyes glinted in the overhead light. "Family? It seems your personal attachments have made you quite vulnerable, Alexander. That's what happens when your secrets come to light." Alexander took a step closer, fists taut at his sides. "You might enjoy seeing me fall, but you'll find out I don't go down easily." Charles gave a light, mocking laugh. "Oh, I'm not alone in wanting you out of the way. There's someone else with a far greater stake in this. Someone who doesn't appreciate your obstacles." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. The idea that Charles might not be working alone had hovered in his mind, but hearing it stated outright felt more threatening. "Who is it?" he demanded, voice low. Charles shrugged with a casual air. "You have no idea how deep this goes." With that, Charles turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving Alexander standing rigid by the long table. Uncertainty gnawed at him. He had no clue how far the conspiracy stretched or who else had a hand in it. If Charles had a powerful backer, the battle was much bigger than a simple boardroom skirmish. He felt the weight of it clamp down on his chest. As he gazed at the city through the tall windows, he realized he had far more to lose than a corporate deal. This was about protecting his daughters and finally proving that he could be the man Olivia needed him to be. The question was how and who he could trust. Charles hints at a powerful backer. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Alexander is left questioning who else might be involved and how far they'll go to ruin him. Alexander stepped out of the meeting room where Charles had delivered his chilling warning, feeling more unsteady than he had in years. The idea that his rival was working with a mysterious figure loomed over his thoughts like a storm cloud. He'd made it back to his office when he noticed how his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from furious investors, staff updates about the next board vote, and half a dozen texts from Robert, all urgent. Every message seemed to hammer home the same question. Would he hold on to his leadership, or would Charles and his unknown partner shove him out for good? Though his fingers itched to check every incoming text, his mind drifted again to Olivia and the twins. Only days ago, he'd spent a carefree afternoon with Emma and Sophia, promising them safety. Now, in the wake of Charles's maneuvers, that promise felt more fragile than ever. This corporate war seemed primed to devour everyone he cared for if he wasn't vigilant. Robert appeared in the doorway, eyes alert. "We're scheduled for an emergency briefing," he said without preamble. "The board wants a status update on the merger. Rumor is that Charles is pushing for a vote of no confidence if you can't settle these headlines." Alexander forced himself to stand taller, squaring his shoulders. "Fine. Let them ask their questions," he replied. "I'll show them I'm still in control." But he knew this was more than just talk. He had to demonstrate actual control or risk losing everything. They stepped into the hallway, past the polished floors and gleaming steel sculptures. The staff parted to let them pass, faces tight with unease. Whispers followed them, speculations about Alexander's personal life and the swirl of negative press. He couldn't escape it, not even in his own building. Just then, he heard raised voices near the elevator bank. A small cluster of onlookers had gathered. Alexander and Robert exchanged a glance, picking up their pace. When they emerged into the open area by the elevators, they found a lean, jittery man locked in an argument with security. The man clutched a camera bag, wearing the telltale scowl of someone on a mission he wouldn't abandon easily. "You can't be here," a security guard insisted, pushing the intruder back. "This is private property." The man spat out a retort. "I have questions for Mr. Morgan, and I'm not leaving until I get answers." Alexander's stomach turned. Another paparazzo, or worse, someone Charles had sent. He approached quickly. "Is there a problem?" he asked, voice chilly. The man pivoted toward him, eyes gleaming with the sort of desperation that made Alexander tense. "Yeah, there is," he snarled, stepping closer than necessary. "You think you can hide behind your walls? I know about the twins, everyone does. My editor wants the real story, not your PR spin." Before Alexander could respond, the man reached into his camera bag. Security guards lunged in, suspecting a weapon. The man jerked away, causing the camera to slip free and clatter to the floor. He cursed, scrambling to grab it. For a brief, tense moment, everyone froze, not sure if this conflict would escalate further. Alexander came forward, forcing composure. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave," he said evenly. "You're trespassing." The man's voice rose. "So it's true then? You've got children you never claimed? You gonna use them to your advantage now? Or are you just trying to play the sympathy card?" His tone dripped with provocation, clearly designed to spark confrontation. Alexander's fists itched to respond, but Robert intervened, pressing a hand against Alexander's shoulder. "He's not worth it," Robert said under his breath. "Let security handle this." Security guards seized the man's arms, hauling him toward the exit. Alexander exchanged a glance with Robert. He knew that any physical outburst might be twisted into new headlines. The man yelled a final taunt over his shoulder before being shoved through the doors. A nerve throbbed in Alexander's forehead. The tension was rolling in faster now, and he barely had a moment to breathe before the next crisis. They rode the elevator to the executive floor in silence. Once they stepped off, Robert glanced at Alexander. "This is just the beginning, you know. Charles or his backers will keep sending these vultures." Alexander exhaled, the steady hum of the elevator still in his ears. "I won't let them get near Olivia or the girls. If they want to target me, fine, but I draw a line there." Robert nodded. "Let's just make sure we don't lose sight of the bigger game. The board's waiting." They reached the boardroom to find everyone already seated. Tension crackled in the air, the directors' faces grim. Charles sat near the far end, wearing an expression that feigned worry. He drummed his fingers on the polished table. "We heard someone caused a disturbance downstairs," he said casually, as though discussing the weather. Alexander took his seat at the head of the table, refusing to let Charles bait him in front of everyone. He steeled his voice. "Let's get started," he told the room. "I understand there have been concerns about our merger timeline." A senior director nodded. "Investors are jumpy, Alexander. The media coverage about your personal situation isn't helping. They want assurances. Can you give us those?" Alexander met the director's gaze with steady resolve. "Yes. Our due diligence is complete, and everything is on track for the final approval next week. Whatever personal matters I'm handling won't derail the company or the merger. We're prepared to move forward as planned." Charles slid his gaze around the table. "Are we certain our CEO can maintain focus with his unexpected obligations?" His tone sounded so polite, yet the implication was clear. "We wouldn't want any, shall we say, disruptions to cost us billions." Alexander suppressed the urge to snap back. "I've managed more challenging deals under worse conditions," he said simply. "I am still fully committed to this merger." A few murmurs sounded among the directors. Some still looked uncertain, while others eyed Charles warily. It was clear that the board was torn, loyal to Alexander's track record, yet enticed by Charles's manipulations. Alexander decided to address it head-on. "I'm aware there's been talk about a vote of no confidence," he said. "If anyone here feels I'm incapable of doing my job, I invite them to say so now. I would rather we address it openly than let rumors erode this company." Silence fell. A few board members traded glances, but none spoke up. Charles smoothed his tie, lips pressing into a thin line. He'd likely wanted someone else to champion the idea, but it seemed no one was willing to be the first to voice it. At length, the senior director cleared his throat. "We'll hold off on that, Alexander. We need to see results, and soon. Next week's timeline must remain solid. Understand?" Alexander inclined his head. Understood. The meeting ended without any direct challenges, though the tension was palpable. One by one, the board members filtered out. Charles hung back for a moment, raising his eyebrows in a theatrical gesture of concern. "I'd hate to see you crumble under the weight of scandal, old friend," he said quietly, emphasizing the last words. "But if you need assistance, you know where to find me." Alexander stared him down, refusing to dignify the comment with a response. Charles gave a slight shrug, then exited with a cunning gleam in his eyes. Robert stepped forward, pressing the door closed. "He's pushing you, hoping you slip up, and now we have even less time to tie up the loose ends on this merger." Alexander ran a hand over his face, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. "Right. We can't let him sabotage it or everything we've built is gone." Then his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it but decided to answer, stepping to one side of the room. "Hello?" A shaky voice responded, low and urgent. "Is this Alexander Morgan?" "Yes. Who is this?" "I have information about Charles Dunham. We should meet. Soon." Alexander's pulse kicked. He glanced at Robert, who raised a questioning brow. "What sort of information?" he asked carefully. "You want to expose him, right? I can help. I was involved. But he can't know I spoke to you. Please." Alexander pictured the man from downstairs, the paparazzo confrontation. It could be a trap. Then again, it could be the break he needed to stop Charles once and for all. "Give me a time and place," he said quietly. "Tomorrow night, 11, the parking garage beneath the old Rivers Tower, top level, and come alone." The line went dead. Alexander stared at his phone, unsettled. If this was legitimate, it might reveal Charles's hidden backer or his next move, or it might be a ruse to corner him. Either way, it was a risk he couldn't ignore. He turned to find Robert waiting. "What is it?" Alexander explained the cryptic call in a low voice. Robert frowned. "You realize it might be a setup." "I know," Alexander said. "But we can't stand by and watch Charles tear everything apart. If this lead pays off, we'll have a way to fight back." Despite his resolve, apprehension flickered in his stomach. They left the boardroom, stepping into a barrage of camera flashes and shouted questions from media outlets that had found their way upstairs. Security tried to contain the crowd, but the corridor was almost impassable. Alexander felt the noise close in on him, journalists demanding comment on the alleged scandal, on his family, on how it might affect the merger. He pushed through, each step echoing with tension. In the midst of the chaos, he pulled out his phone, quickly unlocking it to see a photo of Emma and Sophia that he'd saved. Their bright smiles were a reminder of why he had to keep fighting. They deserved more than a father who crumbled under pressure. Alexander leaves the boardroom under a storm of cameras, uncertain how to stop Charles's schemes in time. He looks at a photo of Emma and Sophia on his phone, resolved to fight back but unsure how. Alexander watched the chaotic reflections of camera flashes bounce off the polished lobby floor, his nerves fraying under the reporters' shouts. Security held the throng of onlookers back, but he could still feel their intrusive presence as he strode toward his private elevator. Their questions rang in his ears. "Is the merger doomed? What about your daughters? Will you resign?" He kept his gaze fixed forward, fighting the urge to snap back at their taunts. Robert joined him in the elevator at the last second, letting out a long sigh as the doors slid shut. "It's worse than ever," he muttered, loosening his tie. "They're running polls online about your CEO status. Shareholders want an emergency briefing, and I've already fielded calls from at least 6 major investors threatening to back out if the drama doesn't die down soon." Alexander rubbed his temples, feeling a headache forming. "They smell blood in the water, that's all. Charles stirred this pot, and now everyone's convinced I'm on the verge of collapse." He frowned, recalling how earlier that morning more articles had dropped, speculating about every corner of his personal life. What was once an open secret, his connection to Emma and Sophia, had become headline fodder. The elevator chimed softly as they arrived at his office floor. Stepping out, Alexander noticed how subdued the atmosphere was. Employees kept their heads down, as if the entire staff had collectively braced for impact. Through the glass walls, he could see small knots of people whispering, glancing his way with uneasy sympathy. Robert checked his phone. "You might want to brace yourself for the next hit. I found something disturbing in our records, or rather your old records." His voice dropped lower. "It's about that buyout from years ago, right before your divorce." Alexander frowned. "Which one? There were a few that year." A dark look crossed Robert's face. "The one involving a smaller firm in financial trouble. I looked into it because I suspected Charles might use any old skeleton against you. Turns out that deal was more complicated than we realized." Alexander's brow knit together as they entered his office. The memory was hazy, a desperate acquisition at a time he was racking up achievements at the cost of ignoring Olivia's fears. He recalled forging ahead with a cutthroat legal strategy on the advice of certain board members, proud of how quickly he'd sealed the agreement. Olivia had questioned the ethics, but he'd brushed her off, too focused on the success it brought his company. Robert set a thick folder on Alexander's desk. "Read it. You'll see how the buyout impacted some smaller businesses, one of them being a company run by someone Olivia cared about. I suspect she never forgave you for that." A chill spread across Alexander's chest. The moment he flipped open the folder, the old legal documents practically leapt off the page. They confirmed a forced closure and mass layoffs. He remembered the triumph he'd felt at the time, securing the acquisition. He'd never really stopped to consider who had been trampled in the process. He glanced at Robert, voice low. "Do you think Charles found this? That he's planning to throw it at me now?" Robert nodded gravely. "Almost certainly. And if he ties it to Olivia personally, it'll look like you betrayed her family back then, or worse, knowingly destroyed the livelihoods of people close to her. It could further wreck your image, both at home and in the company." Alexander stared at the pages, a hollow ache forming in his chest. He could already imagine how Olivia would react if she saw these details laid out in public. She had left him in the midst of that hectic period, claiming she couldn't handle the environment swirling around him. Now everything clicked into place. Maybe she'd realized he cared more about the deal than the moral cost. "I have to talk to her," he said quietly, slamming the folder shut. "I need to explain myself before Charles uses this against me." But it was too late. His phone vibrated on the desk with an incoming call from Olivia. A prickle of dread crawled over his skin as he answered. "Olivia? Are you okay?" Her voice radiated anger. "Did you think I'd never find out, Alexander? That I wouldn't piece together your deals and realize how you contributed to my father losing his business? He never told me all the details, but I just saw the coverage. There's a story circulating that you took pride in shutting him down, all for a tidy profit." He closed his eyes, guilt twisting inside him. "I didn't realize it was your father's company," he said, voice strained. "I was so focused on the acquisition." "I begged you to reconsider," she interrupted, her tone laced with hurt. "You told me we couldn't afford to be sentimental. Now the press says you boasted about it. I feel like I never knew you at all." Her voice shook with the force of withheld tears. "I left because I couldn't stand that version of you. But now this? You didn't just ignore me, you crushed my father's entire livelihood." He could picture her, pacing in her apartment, tears threatening to spill. "I'm sorry," he managed, the words inadequate. "I was blinded by ambition. I didn't connect the dots. I swear I never intended. You keep saying you want to be a father to Emma and Sophia, but how do I trust you with them if you can't even be honest about your past? Her breathing was ragged. This changes everything. I have to protect them, even if that means pushing you away. Fear slammed into him like a tidal wave. Olivia, please don't shut me out, he pleaded. I've changed. She paused, but he heard nothing gentle in her silence. Maybe, she said finally, but this is a wound that won't heal easily. I'm sorry. The call ended, leaving him reeling. He set his phone down with shaking hands. Robert grimaced. You should have told her earlier. It was bound to surface eventually. Alexander didn't argue. He felt raw, exposed, furious at his own neglect all those years ago. And as if the emotional blow weren't enough, the phone buzzed again, this time with an unsympathetic news alert. An article claiming Emma and Sophia were being used as pawns in his corporate chess game. The speculation grew uglier with every paragraph, hinting that the girls might be in dangerous territory if Alexander's rivals escalated their vendettas. Reading it made his hands tremble. The mention of his daughters in the crosshairs of scandal was almost too much to bear. He looked at Robert, eyes burning. We can't let the press keep hounding them, he said through gritted teeth. How do I shut this down without fueling more stories? It might be too late, Robert answered gravely. The board already smells your vulnerability. Investors keep calling for your resignation. Charles is all but ensuring it happens. He's telling them your personal meltdown risks everything. And now, with these new revelations about your past, you're hemorrhaging credibility. Alexander's frustration boiled over. I'd step down if it meant protecting Emma and Sophia. But if Charles takes over, he'll have free rein to do more damage. Not just to me, but possibly to them. Who knows how far this conspiracy goes? Robert cleared his throat, glancing at the floor. You might need to consider a temporary move to shield the girls. Maybe get them out of town until the dust settles. Pain lanced through him at the thought. They shouldn't have to hide. They just found out I exist, and now I'm supposed to vanish from their lives while the scandal dies down? He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, shoulders slumped in defeat. The swirl of corporate condemnation outside felt relentless. If the board forcibly removed him, he'd lose whatever power he had to keep Charles in check. Meanwhile, Olivia was slipping away, outraged and hurt by the old betrayal. And those headlines about Emma and Sophia, he could barely bring himself to read them fully. Robert reached out, placing a tentative hand on Alexander's shoulder. Look, you might not see a way out, but there is still time. You can try to fight these accusations, take accountability, and show the board you won't let your personal issues sink the deal. But you need a strategy. Alexander managed a bitter laugh. A strategy? I can't even manage to keep my family together right now. How do I persuade the entire board I'm in control? He noticed a lone piece of stationery on his desk, the corporate letterhead mocking him with its formality. In one swift motion, he pulled it closer and began scrawling the beginnings of a resignation letter. The pen felt heavy, every stroke draining the hope out of him. Robert watched in silence, eyes wide, but didn't interfere. When he reached the end of the page, Alexander lifted his pen, heart pounding. He stared at the words, I, Alexander Morgan, hereby resign from my position. They blurred before his eyes. Anger flared, but so did an odd sense of relief. Maybe this was the only path to protect Emma and Sophia from the company's cutthroat arena. Maybe stepping aside would keep Olivia from further heartbreak. Yet he hesitated, the pen trembling over the space for his signature. He thought of Emma's trusting face, Sophia's quiet curiosity, and Olivia's tearful eyes. Would resigning truly shield them? Or would it just hand the company and all its power over to Charles and whoever lurked behind him? Finally, he set the unsigned resignation letter on his desk, setting the pen down beside it. He swallowed the tightness in his throat, staring at the quiet cityscape through his window. If he walked away, he could lose everything in more ways than one. If he stayed, he risked dragging them all through more turmoil. Either way, his next move would define the future for his daughters, and maybe for himself. Alexander sets the unsigned resignation letter on his desk, determined to go down fighting. But will this final stand be enough to repair everything he's lost? Alexander stood alone in his office for what felt like an eternity, staring down at the half-written resignation letter on his desk. Outside his window, the skyline stretched in dark silhouettes. Each passing hour had only confirmed the tumult inside the company, and within himself. Olivia had cut off communication, refusing his calls, and the board was increasingly restless. If he walked away now, perhaps he could shield his family from further scrutiny. But the thought made his stomach churn. He couldn't escape the uneasy feeling that stepping down would hand Charles exactly what he wanted, leaving Olivia and the twins vulnerable to the same forces that drove them apart in the first place. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. Robert's voice greeted him. "Meet me at your penthouse in an hour. I've found something you should see." Alexander agreed, feeling a flicker of hope kindle inside him. If Robert had uncovered evidence that could expose Charles or his secret ally, there might still be time to save the company and protect his family from further harm. Later that night, the echo of the penthouse door clicking shut felt eerily loud. Robert stepped in, carrying a slim briefcase. He eyed the restless tension on Alexander's face. "I traced some suspicious activity on the board," he said in a measured tone. "A few unusual votes, proxies placed by someone who never shows up in person. It all points to the same name." Robert popped open the briefcase, laying out sheets of emails and bank transfers. Alexander leaned over the table, scanning them with growing astonishment. Each transaction told the same story. Charles funneling money through intermediaries, evidently paying off at least one board member to sabotage Alexander's leadership from the inside. Notes in the margins indicated vague references to leverage and family revelations. It was enough to show they were deliberately fueling rumors about Emma and Sophia, hoping to destabilize him. "You think it's enough proof?" Alexander asked, a new determination sharpening his voice. Robert nodded. "It ties Charles to at least one director, someone who's hidden behind a shell company. We don't have a direct name yet, but combined with the recordings from that mystery caller at the parking garage, we might have enough to corner him. If we can prove he's paying people to leak stories about you and sabotage the merger, the board can't ignore it." Alexander felt a surge of adrenaline. "Charles and his backer are counting on me to fold. Let's show them I'm still fighting." He paused, remembering the last time he tried to approach Olivia with new information. She'd barely given him a chance to speak. Even so, he couldn't go forward without her knowing he was ready to take responsibility and stand up for their daughters. Early the next morning, he dialed Olivia's number yet again. As expected, it went to voicemail. This time, he left a brief, heartfelt message. "I know you don't want to hear from me, but I'm not backing down. I'm fighting for the company and for you and the twins. I made terrible mistakes in the past, and I can't erase them, but I promise I won't repeat them. If you can find it in your heart, just listen to what I uncover about Charles. He's the real threat here." He ended the call, feeling no real assurance she would listen. Still, pressing on seemed the only choice left. He turned his attention to the next step, confronting Charles in a setting where the entire board would hear his revelations. Robert arranged an emergency meeting, spreading word that Alexander had crucial updates on the merger. True to form, Charles used the opportunity to slip in his own agenda, likely expecting to pounce on any sign of weakness. The rest of the directors arrived with uneasy expressions, bracing for more drama. The boardroom buzzed with tension. Suits rustled as people settled into seats. Charles had claimed one near the center, wearing a calmly confident smirk. Despite the swirling rumors, he looked utterly at ease, like a man who believed he had already won. Alexander took a moment to steel himself. He caught Robert's eye, receiving a small nod of encouragement. Once everyone was assembled, Alexander began in a clear, resolute voice. "I appreciate you all coming on such short notice. The past few weeks have been a whirlwind of rumor, leaks, and attempts to undermine this company's stability. I admit my personal life has drawn unwanted attention, but the real scandal isn't about my family at all." A murmur rippled through the room. Several board members glanced at one another, uncertain. Charles leaned back casually. "Well," he said, "if there's a scandal in the works, by all means, enlighten us." Alexander approached the head of the table, projecting confidence he hoped the board could sense. "You're right, Charles. There is a scandal." He pulled out copies of the incriminating documents Robert had gathered, distributing them to each director. "These payments and communications show that at least one board member was paid to funnel stories about me to the press, deliberately damaging not only my reputation but the company's. And that money came directly from shell accounts linked to you." Charles's face froze for just a fraction of a second before he smiled. "Shell accounts? My dear Alexander, I'm afraid you'll have to be more convincing than a few scattered documents. After all, anyone can fabricate email trails these days." A few directors raised eyebrows, flipping through the papers. Alexander's expression remained steady. "We have more than email trails. Multiple witnesses can confirm the funds traced back to you." He hesitated, then added, "We also have voice recordings from sources who've dealt with your intermediaries. It's enough to launch a thorough investigation by an external firm. If needed, we'll do exactly that." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Charles's jaw tightened, though he still tried to maintain an air of composure. "Why would I bother undermining our own merger?" he asked smoothly. "I stand to gain from it just as much as anyone else here." Alexander nodded. "Unless there's another backer waiting in the wings, promising you a greater reward if this company falters. Maybe that backer is just as happy to see me gone. Whatever your motive, it ends now." One of the more senior directors, a dignified woman with gray hair, looked up from the documents. "If these allegations are true, Charles, you've not only betrayed the board, you've jeopardized the entire future of this company. We have to investigate this." A chorus of agreements rumbled through the room. Charles cleared his throat, turning an unsettling shade of pale. He glanced around, realizing the tide was turning against him. "This is all ridiculous," he said with a forced laugh. "I won't stand for these baseless accusations." Alexander inhaled slowly, pushing aside the tension gripping his chest. He knew this was the moment to lay everything on the table, even the part that made him most vulnerable. "There's one more thing," he said, voice quieter. "I want to make a public statement, acknowledging Emma and Sophia as my daughters. I've hesitated before, afraid it would harm our stock prices or the merger. But the truth is more important than the fallout." Gasps flitted across the board. From the corner of his eye, he saw Robert stand a little straighter, silent but supportive. "I'm prepared to assume any consequences," Alexander continued. "I won't hide or deny them anymore. My personal life isn't a corporate tool to be used against me, and I won't let my children be pawns in someone else's game." Several directors exchanged surprised glances, some nodding. Even those who had been skeptical about Alexander's leadership seemed moved by his candor. Charles, on the other hand, sat stone-faced, lips pressed into a thin line. Alexander turned to face him. "You tried to weaponize my family, to stoke fear on this board about my ability to lead. You'll fail, and I have the evidence to prove it." Charles shot to his feet, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "This is absurd," he hissed, refusing to look at the documents in front of him. "You're twisting facts just to keep your throne." But the board was no longer blindly following his insinuations. The accusations, the emails, the financial trails, they painted a damning picture. One director cleared his throat, voice grim. "We'll need an immediate investigation. I suggest we temporarily suspend Charles from his role until this is resolved." The room filled with a low hum of agreement, except for Charles, who stood rigidly by the table, trying to compose himself. He clenched his fists as he looked around, searching for any ally. His face flushed, denial etched into every tense line of his mouth. A faint quiver betrayed his mounting fear. Charles stands, face flushed, denying everything, but the board members stare at him in shock. Alexander quietly utters, "I'm not done yet," leaving the entire room braced for the next bombshell. A deep, uneasy silence weighed on the boardroom. Charles stood at the head of the table, his face flushed with anger as he vehemently denied every accusation. Around him, the directors shuffled in their seats, exchanging uncertain looks. They'd just witnessed Alexander presenting evidence of Charles's covert deals, and tension crackled in the air like static electricity. "I'm not done yet," Alexander repeated quietly, his voice carrying a calm sense of finality. He exchanged a glance with Robert, who nodded in encouragement. Then he turned back to the group, picking up a slim folder. "There's more you need to see, documents that expose an even deeper plot." Charles let out an incredulous laugh. "What more could you possibly have? You've shown a bunch of doctored paperwork and wild accusations." His gaze darted across the room, hoping for support from any wavering board member. But many of them simply looked away, discomfited by the seriousness of the allegations. Alexander advanced around the table, distributing fresh copies of emails and memos. "These messages reference direct intimidation tactics," he said, "threats made to individuals who opposed Charles's methods. They outline deliberate smear campaigns against me, including attacks on my personal life, using Olivia, Emma, and Sophia as leverage." A murmur of disbelief rippled among the directors. One frowned, scanning the documents as though they might catch fire in his hands. "Is this real?" he asked, looking up at Charles. "It mentions blackmail." Charles's eyes flickered. He forced a mirthless smile. "You can't be serious. Alexander must have forged these. Why would I endanger the very merger I've been pushing for?" "That's exactly the question." Alexander glanced around the table. "Why? Unless someone else is paying you more to sink this deal or remove me from power. These emails suggest there's another hand involved, someone who stands to benefit if our stock price falls or if I'm forced out." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Before Charles could retort, a sharp rap on the conference room's glass door drew everyone's attention. It swung open to reveal a figure many on the board recognized but rarely saw, Mr. Thomason, a senior member known for his shadowy presence and silent influence. In a hush, he walked into the room and stood near Charles, his expression stiff as if he'd been caught under bright lights he couldn't escape. Alexander's eyes narrowed. He'd suspected hidden allies behind Charles, but seeing Thomason stride in, shoulders tense, confirmed there was something more at play. Several directors shifted uncomfortably. Thomason rarely appeared at standard board meetings. He was usually content to cast votes from afar. The older man cleared his throat. "I need to address this situation," he said in a gravelly voice. "It's true that I encouraged Charles to move against Alexander, but only because I believed it necessary for the company's future." His gaze darted to Alexander. "You were distracted with your personal affairs. Someone had to keep us afloat." A flurry of shocked exclamations burst from the board members. Charles threw Thomason a startled look. It was as if his own co-conspirator had stepped forward to claim responsibility, perhaps to salvage what remained of their plan. Alexander stood his ground. "So you admit to orchestrating attacks on my family and spreading false rumors to destabilize my leadership?" Thomason's lips thinned. "I had no intention of harming your children. We just needed you vulnerable enough to relinquish control. Our investors are anxious about your personal scandal. We did what we had to do." The admission chilled the room. More than a few directors glared at Thomason and Charles, outrage simmering in their eyes. Someone muttered, "We never agreed to sabotage the CEO's family," while another asked, "What did you gain from all this?" Charles made one last, desperate attempt to reframe the narrative. None of this had to happen, he said, voice unsteady. But Alexander's secrets, his refusal to come clean, he brought all of this on himself. Look at the media firestorm. We couldn't risk the merger falling apart because of him. Alexander refused to let him wriggle out of accountability. He pressed a button on a small recording device and the boardroom filled with the echo of Charles's voice from a previous meeting, threatening to leak information if Alexander didn't step down, referencing hush money for an unnamed reporter. By the time the recording ended, Charles was ashen, and Thomason looked quietly furious at having their methods exposed so openly. A flurry of noise erupted, directors speaking over one another, demanding answers, calling for an immediate vote to suspend both Charles and Thomason. It was chaos, the entire board in uproar. In the middle of that tumult, Alexander noticed movement by the doorway. Olivia. She stood there, uncertain, flanked by a security guard who must have let her in. Her expression was a torrent of emotions, fear, disbelief, a flicker of relief when her gaze rested on Alexander. She'd come, though he couldn't guess what had finally drawn her here. Charles spotted her too, and a flash of anger contorted his features. He raised his voice above the din. "You think you can paint me as a villain? There's enough blood on your hands, Alexander. You destroyed her father's company, didn't you? Isn't that why she left you?" Olivia drew a sharp breath, stepping forward. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I know exactly what you did, Charles. The rumors, the threats. I heard enough outside the door just now to confirm it." Her presence cut through the board's clamoring. People turned to stare. Olivia held her chin high, walking until she stood beside Alexander. "You threatened me in the past," she said evenly, turning her gaze to Charles. "Subtle threats, implying if I stayed with Alexander, we'd be caught in a corporate crossfire. I left to keep Emma and Sophia safe. That doesn't excuse Alexander's mistakes, but it doesn't absolve you either." The hush that followed seemed to crush the air from the room. Charles stared at her, struggling for a response, but no words came. Robert, who'd watched everything intently, seized the moment. "I suggest we call a vote," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "We have enough evidence of misconduct against Charles and those who colluded with him. They've acted against the company's best interests." Several directors nodded, already moving to remove Charles from the board entirely. One rose from his chair, calling security. Another tapped furiously on a tablet to prepare an emergency motion. Charles's gaze flitted around the table, searching for a final lifeline. "Don't do this," he hissed, but the board members were done listening. Security guards arrived, ushering Charles away from the table. Thomason, too, resigned to an unceremonious exit, attempted to save face by quietly gathering his papers. Olivia remained close to Alexander, her posture tense. He could see tears gathering in her eyes, though she fought to hide them. He reached out, unsure if she'd accept his touch, but she let his hand settle gently against her arm. A swirl of relief flooded him. She believed him enough to stand with him in this moment. Just then, the large screen on the wall blinked with an incoming video call from an overseas investor. One of the directors quickly answered. The face of a foreign financier appeared, eyes bright with intensity. "I've seen the news," the man said. "It's about time. We've been waiting for leadership to stand up to corruption. Our investment still stands with Alexander Morgan, provided these saboteurs are removed. We recognize integrity when we see it." An undercurrent of gratitude rippled through the board. The tension slowly released as relief replaced the looming dread. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wave of emotion roll over him. At last, the very thing he feared, exposure, had become his saving grace. Moments later, they concluded the call. The directors conferred briefly, then turned to Alexander. "We acknowledge your ownership of the truth," said the senior director solemnly, "and your willingness to defend the company and your family. If you remain committed to leading us through the merger, we support you." A breathless hush fell over the room. Alexander nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he managed, glancing at Olivia, who gave him the slightest hint of a smile. He squeezed her hand gently. Over by the corner, Charles was still being escorted away. His face glowed with fury as he snapped, "This isn't over!" His words hung in the air like a fresh warning, even as security hustled him into the hall. The echo of his footsteps dissipated, leaving the board members to stare at one another, shaken but resolute. Alexander stood there, heart pounding, Olivia's arm tucked close to his side. He felt triumph and relief, but also a twist of anxiety. Charles might have been exposed, but his final words rang with bitterness. Who knew what he would try next? Though Charles has been exposed, he issues a chilling parting shot. This isn't over. The corporate halls echo with uncertainty. Has the threat truly ended? Sunlight streamed through the glass windows of the executive floor like a promise of new beginnings. A restless hush blanketed the corridors. Everyone knew Charles had been escorted out after his exposure, and the air buzzed with cautious hope. Alexander stood in the open lobby, letting the warmth of day fall over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe without the weight of deceit and rumors crushing his chest. The board had reconvened that morning to finalize decisions. Charles was officially removed from all duties, pending a deeper investigation into his sabotage. Thomason, the shadowy shareholder, had resigned in disgrace, leaving no question that the company was finally free of the toxic undercurrent that had threatened its stability. Alexander tugged at his tie, a small smile working its way onto his face. The swirl of corporate lawyers, staff, and directors whirled around him, but for once he felt calm. The immediate crisis had passed, though he knew he'd have to remain vigilant. Last night, he had hardly slept. Charles's parting words still echoed in his mind. This isn't over. Yet with each step through the hall, Alexander's confidence grew. He had faced worse storms than the tantrums of a man proven guilty before the entire board. He slipped into his office and quietly locked the door, taking a moment for himself. The place felt different now, less a battlefield, more a space where he could rebuild. The wide windows revealed the city spreading outward, bright and alive. For the first time since he'd learned about his daughters, Alexander allowed himself a moment of pure relief. He was still CEO. He'd exposed Charles's conspiracy, and most importantly, he had affirmed in front of the board and the world that Emma and Sophia were his. A soft knock pulled him out of his thoughts. Robert poked his head in, looking drained but relieved. "You all right?" he asked, stepping inside. Alexander nodded, dropping into the chair behind his desk. "Tired, but I'll survive. How are things on the legal front?" "Busy," Robert admitted, crossing the room. "The lawyers have started drafting the official statements. The board wants you to make a public appearance, maybe a press conference, to solidify the company's stability." Alexander exhaled. "Makes sense. The press will want to hear straight from me, especially after all the speculation." Robert tapped a folder of documents. "They'll also expect you to address your family situation again, confirm the truth. Are you ready to talk openly?" Alexander paused. When he first discovered he was a father, the idea of publicly acknowledging Emma and Sophia felt like stepping into quicksand. Now, after everything that had happened, it felt essential. "I am," he said, quiet resolve shaping his words. "I won't hide them anymore. This is our life." Robert's relief was tangible. He gave Alexander a pat on the shoulder. "Good. We'll set it up for tomorrow." With that, he turned to go, pausing briefly at the door. "I'm glad you chose to fight, Alexander." The office fell silent again as Robert left. A new wave of thoughts filled Alexander's mind. Olivia. He hadn't seen her since she'd stood beside him during Charles's downfall. She'd slipped out afterward, overwhelmed by the confrontation. He hadn't pressed her. He wanted to give her space. But now he needed to see her, to clarify how their future might look. Stepping into the private elevator, Alexander keyed in the code for the parking garage. Outside, city traffic hummed. The route to Olivia's condo felt strangely familiar and yet tinged with fresh tension. He parked on the curb, noticing how quiet the street was at mid-morning. A group of children played with chalk on the sidewalk, their laughter drifting upward in the warm air. It reminded him of Emma and Sophia instantly. He buzzed Olivia's unit, heart thumping. After a moment, her voice crackled through the intercom, sounding hesitant. "Alexander?" He pressed the button, leaning close to the speaker. "Can we talk? I promise I won't take too much of your time." Silence hung for a few seconds, then the lock clicked. He made his way upstairs, steeling himself for whatever reaction might greet him. When she opened the door, he noticed the telltale signs of stress around her eyes, but also a softness in her gaze that he hadn't seen for a while. Olivia stepped aside. "Come in." Her tone was cautious, yet there was no bitterness to it, just a guarded warmth that made his breath catch. He entered the living room, taking in the scattered toys and coloring books on the coffee table. Every trace of domestic life reminded him of the bond he was determined to preserve. She gestured for him to sit. He did so carefully, resting his hands on his knees. I want to apologize again," he began, searching her eyes, "for everything that happened with your father's business, for every way I failed you. If I'd understood, if I'd truly listened, I would have never gone through with that acquisition. I can't change the past, but I won't run from it anymore." Olivia folded her arms, eyes flickering with conflicting emotions. "I was so angry when I realized you'd been part of what hurt my father. We lost so much back then. And your ambition, I felt like you chose it over us. So I left." She looked down, fiddling with a ring on her finger. "But I've seen how hard you've fought these last few weeks. For the twins, for me, for the truth." Her voice trembled slightly. "The night I came to the boardroom, I wasn't sure if I'd find the same ruthless CEO who once ignored my pleas. Instead, I saw a man willing to protect his family." She looked at him directly, something in her expression lifting. "I may not have forgiven everything yet, but I believe in the changes you're making." Alexander reached across the space between them. "I want you to believe in my intentions, not just for now, but for every day after. The girls deserve a father who's there for them, and you deserve a partner you can trust." She swallowed, her eyes glistening. "I'm scared to let you in," she admitted softly. "Every day I told myself we were safer without you, but you've shown me a different side, and I—" She broke off, tears threatening. He gently rested his hand over hers, feeling the warmth of her skin. "I won't push you into anything," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Just let me be part of their lives. Let me show you I'm not the man I used to be." Olivia closed her eyes, inhaling unsteadily. Then, with a resolute exhale, she squeezed his hand. "The twins are in their bedroom," she said. "Why don't you say hi?" Relief coursed through him, and he stood with a tiny smile. Following her lead, he stepped into the hallway that led to a small bedroom door cracked open. Inside, Emma and Sophia were busy coloring on the floor, crayons and paper scattered about. They looked up at once, recognizing him. Emma's face broke into a grin, while Sophia's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Daddy!" Emma exclaimed. Her little voice stunned him for a moment. He'd never tire of hearing that word from her lips. "Hi, Princess," he said, kneeling beside them. "What are you two working on?" Sophia showed him her drawing, a bright sun over a house with 4 stick figures holding hands. She pointed to one in a suit, proclaiming, "That's you!" Alexander laughed softly. It looked more like a square-headed cartoon character, but his heart swelled nonetheless. Olivia joined them, resting against the doorframe, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. For a moment, the 4 of them were a small world unto themselves, safe and connected. Alexander realized that no corporate triumph could compare to this feeling of acceptance and love. Still, he remembered Charles's final threat. Though the man was gone, there might be repercussions. Alexander straightened his back, determined to be ready for anything. But for now, he savored the peace of this moment with his family. Sometime later, after reading a picture book to the twins, Alexander said his goodbyes. He promised to pick them up from kindergarten soon, and Olivia nodded in agreement, her eyes flickering with tentative hope. That single sign of trust sent a surge of gratitude through him. They were finally moving toward a shared life, one grounded in honesty rather than hidden resentments. At the office the following day, a press conference took place in the company's main lobby. Cameras flashed, microphones lined a wooden podium. The tension in the air was thick as reporters whispered among themselves, waiting. Alexander stepped forward in front of a bright backdrop featuring the company logo. Robert stood a few paces behind him, silent support in every line of his posture. Alexander cleared his throat, gazing out at the sea of expectant faces. I understand there's been widespread speculation about my personal life. Today, I want to acknowledge the truth. Emma and Sophia are my daughters, and I'm proud to say so publicly. For too long, I allowed fear of scandal to keep me silent. That ends now. He paused, scanning the crowd. The cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every angle of his resolve. I also want to address recent events in our board. Sabotage and collusion threatened our future, but we've removed those who acted in bad faith. Despite what some may claim, this company remains strong, and I remain committed to guiding it with integrity. A flutter of voices erupted from the reporters. Flashbulbs popped like tiny fireworks. Alexander nodded curtly, stepping away. He had no desire to linger on a stage where people still asked invasive questions. He'd said all he needed to say. Within minutes, the press swirled, analyzing his statement, broadcasting his words to viewers across the city. Robert joined him in a nearby hallway, a hint of a smile on his face. That was good, he said. Genuine. Now let's see how the public reacts. Alexander glanced at his phone, half expecting a barrage of new messages. Then he thought of the tiny yard in front of Olivia's condo, where Emma and Sophia might one day play without fear of paparazzi lurking. A sense of relief poured through him. He'd made the stand he needed to make. But as the day wound down, a final message flashed on his phone screen from an unknown number. He tapped to read it, heart lurching at the short, ominous text. We still have unfinished business. He stared at it, the corridors of the building dimming with twilight. A swirl of dread mingled with resolve. That lingering threat could be Charles, or someone else connected to the failed conspiracy. Either way, he wouldn't let fear control him again. He pocketed his phone, stepping into the elevator with a new kind of calm. His family was waiting, and he planned to protect them at any cost. Alexander receives a text. We still have unfinished business. He tucks the phone away, determined to protect the family he's finally regained, proving that, while the battle is won, the story of his love and courage will continue. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.